Nature in My Backyard. This is part of something called Nature in My Backyard, which hopefully everyone is familiar with. And this is an initiative of the Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland, the Master Gardeners of Cuyahoga County, the Shaker Lakes Garden Club, and it endeavors to bring nature to your backyard, encourage you to start rethinking about how you want to engage nature in the place where you live by getting rid of invasive species, by planting native plants, and by creating functional habitat for biodiversity, for our native biodiversity. So we salute that you're here. This is a monthly program that we do, and these programs are archived. If you go to natureinmybackyard.clevelandaudubon.org, you can, and please do so and play around on the website because there's a tremendous amount of great information there, in addition to a link to where you can find these videos. In addition, one of the services that is being provided by Nature in My Backyard, which is pretty unique in this region, is that if you are so inclined and you don't know where to start in terms of creating a native habitat or getting rid of invasive species in your yard, we have teams of master gardeners who, on a volunteer basis, can come to your house and advise you on where to make a start, what's invasive, what's not invasive, and maybe give you a roadmap towards creating some really functional biodiverse habitat. So great organization. We are glad you're here. We're glad you know about it. And just give you a pitch for next month, which I believe will be on the 7th. I don't know if it's, I don't know. I'm not sure I have the date right. But I believe it's the 7th. Will be Hope Taft, former First Lady of the state of Ohio, who will be telling us about the ecoregions of Ohio. So that should be really exciting. So definitely come back for that. Okay, this is a program that I am a Harvey Webster, by the way. I'm a board member of the Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland, and I'm a former staff member at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and currently their ambassador emeritus. And so it's been my pleasure to host Brown Bag in My Backyard. And I got cornered by Jane Ellison, who said, Harvey, do a program on winter. Well, I don't have a program in winter. I used to have one. It was a great one, and I used live animals to to illustrate it when I was a working stiff at the museum. So I could bring out a great horned owl, I could bring out a snake or what have you. I don't have those anymore. So I have been desperately trying to assemble images. And so I have to give a shout out to a very good friend of mine, David Trevarthen, who is an incredible photographer out in Lake County, mostly at Metter Marsh and Metter Headlands, as well as the Holden Arboretum. And he's just become an amazing student of nature, armed with a Canon R6 and a really long telephoto lens. So almost, I'd say 99% of the images that I'll be presenting today are all his. And I'm just going to do a little bit of a narrative around that. So with that introduction, let me see if I can get into sharing my screen. I want to do this. And I am screen sharing, so that's good. And I want to start slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so everybody see this? I hope. Never mind, you're all muted anyway.
You're good, Harvey.
So wild about winter. So this is an interesting time of the year. Not only because we're preparing, we've just been gluttons for turkey, which by the way is dinosaur. It's always interesting when you're carving that turkey on Thanksgiving Day to recognize the anatomy of the turkey is very familiar and very similar to the anatomy of a theropod dinosaur, of which it's derived because we know that dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds. We won't have to go into that, but we might touch on a little bit. And we're looking forward to the holiday season here. And the winter solstice is going to be upon us pretty quickly. And it's an interesting time of the year because, I'm looking out my window now and it's sleeting and all of that beautiful snow that we had with the animal tracks in it is now becoming slush and mush. It's sort of becoming a typical Cleveland winter day and not particularly pleasant. And the leaves have fallen and the yard looks pretty stark. And it's kind of like, yeah, okay, not much happening out there. It's almost as if the landscape is dead. Well, as we all know, it's far from it. So turns out that this is a fascinating time of year because our days are getting shorter leading up to the solstice. And we all know that it's all due to the obliquity of the Earth's axis. And for us at the winter solstice, the axis is pointed away from the sun. So we are getting less sunlight and shorter days. And that brings on winter, and winter conditions require of all organisms some strategy to be able to withstand them. So we have long, long nights and short, short days. But the cool thing about long nights is you have opportunities to revel in the moon. This is not the picture of the supermoon from last week, which truly was spectacular. Jane can talk about it perhaps later on, witnessing it in Crane Country in northwestern Indiana. And by the way, when they call it a supermoon, the part of the orbit that the moon was in last week at its totality, it turns out that it was about 13,000 miles closer to Earth than on average. And that makes it appear 30% larger. So that's big. And particularly when you have a clear night, which fortunately we had a clear night to witness it, it really is a spectacular thing. And so rather than the sun, it seems like the moon rules the world in wintertime. And the landscape indeed starts looking very, very stark. But it's interesting in looking stark, it's kind of like the landscape is reduced to its elements. It's elemental. It's like the landscape has been reduced, it's been bared. So you see its bones, its skeletons. You see the fractal designs of tree branches and tree trunks. I mean, it really is something poets, as a matter of fact, there's a little quote from Hal Borland that I'd like to share towards the end of this about this particular season. So it's fascinating to go out there and just appreciate it. This is a great picture that David took a little bit of artistic license. We're looking skyward, again, the fractal patterns of the canopy branches and how the trees have arranged themselves in response to their search for sunlight in an opening in the forest canopy. They've arranged themselves vis-a-vis their neighbors to maximize the amount of light that they can get. And these patterns become really apparent. They're not interfering with one another. They're trying to occupy the space which they can most successfully to their ends. But of course, it's a time when all these deciduous trees have dropped their leaves, which seems like a terrible extravagance. You know, why would you want to drop your leaves? I'm going to go back here a picture. If you invest so much energy in creating leaves, and leaves are your powerhouse photosynthetic factories that are sequestering, they're taking water and carbon dioxide and creating sugars. That's the basis of like the entire food chain, and then sequestering them in their tissues and in their roots. But the problem with winter, if you're a deciduous tree, is that the circulatory system of a deciduous tree is driven by transpiration, this remarkable and powerful force whereby through evapotranspiration through the pores of the leaves of the tree, water is literally drawn up through the roots, up through the tissues of the tree, and then ultimately out into the branches, into the twigs, into the leaves, and into the atmosphere. And this is an amazing driver that brings water up and nutrients up, and then sugars then take the gravity feed going back down. The problem with leaves, though, is that when you get to winter and water freezes, if you tried to keep this system going, you would not be able to move any water through your leaves, and you basically would desiccate. It's almost like winter is a desert, particularly if your root ball is all now frozen. You can't draw things up, and it would be an abundant waste of your energy, your built up energy, to try and do so. So what do is you lose your leaves in these beautiful patterns that David has captured here. I love this oak leaf sitting on some fresh ice. And in so doing, you shut down that machinery and you've sequestered as much of the nutrients as you possibly can from the leaf. And you just then abandon the structure. And as the leaf litter builds up and creates the duff around the base of the tree, as it decomposes, of course, all of um, the the elements and the nutrients from those leaves can ultimately be recycled and taken back up by the roots of the tree in future years. Might take a little bit longer for a tannin-filled leaf like a red oak leaf, but the fact of the matter is that it's possible. So this is what's driving this. It's a response, an incredibly adaptive response for dealing with wintertime. And they've treated bark itself as insulation for the tissues underneath. And they can use the glucose that they manufacture to get into cells to help prevent cells from rupturing when water turns to ice and expands, which is a pretty neat trick. So, they are well adapted for that thing. And it's an interesting thing to see. Now, some leaves remain on the trees, something we call marcescence. So here's a picture. You got a oak in the foreground, but you got those beeches there that are retaining their leaves. And oftentimes small, younger beeches will retain their leaves all through the wintertime. They are not, they're functionally cut off from the circulatory system of the beech tree. They just haven't dropped. So it adds to some color to what sometimes you might think is a bleak winter landscape. So this is a fascinating dynamic that goes on. And of course, winter is challenging for lots of things. Once you've got a layer of snow on the ground, it's kind of, difficult for lots of organisms to be able to find food. There are obviously trees that do not shed their leaves. These hemlocks have not shed their needles, nor are they going to in the middle of the winter. They'll do that in warm weather months. But with the conifers, which are an ancient group of trees, the gymnosperms, they actually have a waxy protective covering on the needles themselves, which helps limit that loss of water. And so they can retain their needles throughout. And for us in wintertime, the sight of green, whether it's a white pine or these hemlocks, always is something reassuring. I mean, if you weren't aware of things like, the Earth's rotation and the obliquity of its axis and why we have solstices back in the dark ages, and you might be thinking to yourself, the world has come to an end. Certainly the greenery in the landscape is a sign of hope, and perhaps that's why we like to have cut greens to bring them into our house at this time of year to sort of remind us of the life that is latent and still exists out there. Now, that's what trees have to do. Now, organisms that are faced with this dilemma of winter have a couple choices. The most expedient choice would seem to be the monarch's choice. So monarch butterflies, as we all know, undergo a migration. And so the last generation that's produced in August, September, those guys are not going to reproduce here. They're going to head on down towards Mexico and spend the winter there. And then they'll reproduce in perhaps South Texas. And their great-grandchildren will be the ones that return back up here, and we'll see next summer. So they deal with winter by avoiding it altogether, by getting out of town, which on paper sounds like a really fabulous idea. Like, this is a great concept. I like going down to Florida in the middle of wintertime. Why wouldn't any of us want to be a snowbird like that? But it comes at an extraordinary cost. If anything that migrates, whether it's a bird, whether it's dragonflies, whether it's monarch butterflies, you are dependent upon habitat along the way for you to be able to forage, pollinator patches, if you will, places where you can nectar if you're a monarch. And then you have a destination in the case of the monarch of mountains in Mexico, where at a particular elevation, you roost in gigantic numbers on these evergreens, and you're at the mercy of the conservation efforts of those forests down there. If you have forest areas that are logged or if they're developed in some way, then these ancestral destinations of the monarchs wither, and you have a double whammy of the monarchs losing those feeding opportunities on the way south, as well as perhaps having less opportunity to successfully roost and survive the winter. So there are huge costs, plus the fact there's lots of predators. Now, we know famously that monarchs, their host plant are milkweeds, and milkweeds have a latex sap, which renders them toxic, but toxic to mammals and birds, not toxic to wasps and a whole myriad of other things. So it's not that they're without enemies, without things that could prey upon them. So there are hazards to. So migration, great idea, but just it doesn't come without its cost. Um, this and birds certainly will do so. I think I've got this slide a little bit out of place here. This is actually a photograph that David took in Fairport Harbor, and these are a bunch of diving ducks. So you've got lesser and greater scaup, you've got some canvasback, you've got I don't think I see any redhead, but this is an amazing conglomeration of diving ducks who are migratory, that they show up here generally in October, November into December, and some will stick around. But as Lake Erie and the marshes and the deep water rather start freezing up, they will have to depart and find open water someplace else. It's not that they can't tolerate the cold, it's just that they need access to open water, and if that's denied them, they got to continue going further south. Perils about the birds that do stick around here, like Canada geese, of which we know that we have a large population that's now basically resident, is that they're fair game for our national bird. Bald eagles are big on eating, particularly animals that seem to be in distress. So wintertime, if you have areas of open water that are getting smaller and smaller, and there are fewer opportunities for the geese to feed, some of them are going to get weak. Some of them, if they get up on the ice, will be identified by a powerful predator like a bald eagle, and they'll come in and they will prey upon them. Actually, bald eagles can be a significant source of predation on geese. Bald eagles and coyotes on their nests. And then we got a lot of birds that migrate, but end up, this is their destination. So this is a beautiful little white-throated sparrow with his handsome yellow lores. And this is a bird that is one of our common migrants. As the warblers have ceased and desist, and towards the end of October, it becomes sparrow season, and we have huge numbers of white-throated sparrows. Unfortunately, they're a very common casualty. Downtown Cleveland, the volunteers of Lights Out Cleveland pick up more white-throated sparrows than just about any bird. They get very, very confused. They're coming through in large numbers, and they get very confused at dawn by all of the plate glass and the reflection in those windows. So that puts them in harm's way. But we'll have these. I generally have these at my feeder in Kirtland all winter long, and they're a delight to see. It's kind of fun to take a look at this bird, right now, and just take a look at just something about its structure. Birds are remarkable organisms. We talked before about the fact that when you're carving up that turkey, you're carving up basically a theropod dinosaur. We know that in the dinosaurs, we had a group of two-legged dinosaurs called the theropods that we long thought were the ancestors of birds. But in the last 30 years, we've been finding more and more theropods that aren't birds that are covered with feathers. There's actually the presence of feathers, some very rudimentary, some pretty sophisticated, not being used for flight in these theropods, probably being used for thermoregulation and probably used for perhaps defensive coloration or for attracting a mate. But feathers are a really, really interesting adaptation. Feathers are made of keratin. Okay, so they're basically a modified dinosaur scale. And they have a central rachis, a vein, if you will, and then they'll have barbs and barbules. And the barbules themselves can act like little Velcro strips so that the contour feathers of a bird can actually knit together and form a very, very nice, pretty weatherproof surface. Um, and if you take a look at this white-throated sparrow here, you see how he's got his feathers fluffed up. His actual body underneath that's probably half the size of what you see. What looks like this big fat neck is a long skinny neck that's concealed under all those feathers. And below the contour feathers, and the contour feathers form the exterior that make them aerodynamic. And then when properly maintained with waxy fatty acids and oils from the uropygial gland, a little pimple-like gland above the tail, which the bird will squeeze in its beak and then massage, if you will, or preen those oils into the feathers. It maintains a water repellent, almost a waterproof surface. And this is their outerwear. If you remember, if you have the shell, if you've got a down vest, for instance, or a down coat, we know that down is spectacular insulation. Well, guess who invented it? Birds. But it doesn't do very well if it gets wet. So these contour feathers actually protect the downy feathers underneath. And if the bird fluffs those contour feathers and fluffs up the downy feathers underneath, it traps more and more air, and that it forms a spectacular layer of insulation. So these tiny little organisms depend upon this covering of feathers. Also, they depend upon for flight too. We get off of this and look at some others. So the white-throated sparrows, some of them could be migrating through and moving on, but many of them, this is as far as they need to go to spend the winter. Likewise, American tree sparrows that look superficially like the chipping sparrows that delight us in the summertime with a rusty cap. But the bicolored bill is distinctive, and if this bird was facing, you'd see a central breast spot. These are birds of the far north that are just showing up here now. And again, this is as far as they'll go. So some birds migrate to the ends of the earth. Some birds just migrate altitudinally. They go from higher elevations to low. Some just jump from one biome, let's say the hemlock northern hardwood forest biome, to the beech maple biome of Ohio. They go as far as they need to go because, again, the costs of migration can be great. Again, appreciating birds that we see commonly in our backyard, take a look at this blue jay on the left and the blue jay on the right, and you can just see that ability for them to expand the feathers, to totally fluff up. And you'll also notice that you can't even see the feet on the bird on the right. The feathers are fluffed up so that the feet are actually covered, as is most everything else except the face. So if this bird was going to sleep for the night, what it would ultimately do is take its beak and it would submerge its beak in the front of its face into the feathers of the back. And that way it gives protection to its face and allows it to actually breathe preheated air. It's kind of like if you're outside and you breathe into your hands to warm them up, same kind of idea. And so once they're in that posture, they're really well adapted for getting through a cold night. I mean, these birds have got adaptations that are important to the latitude at which they're found, and blue jays can be highly migratory. And if you've ever been to McGee Marsh or Mentor Headlands, either in spring or fall migration, and seen a steady stream of blue jays flying north in the spring or south in the fall, and doing so silently, which is something that blue jays find it hard to do in your backyard. They're clearly moving in large numbers, but the ones that are in our neighborhoods are resident. And they're very social. And oftentimes when they come to your backyard bird feeding station, they come as a family group. They come, mom and dad and this year's kids. Very adaptable. They're partial to all sorts of seeds and nuts. They love acorns. And they're can be sometimes a bully around your feeding stations, but they're really inquisitive, really intelligent, and remarkable birds. Once had a blue jay at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History back in the 1980s when we were doing wildlife rehabilitation. And this bird had come in as a youngster and he had a deformed bill. The bill kind of looked like a cross bill. And we called him Bad Boy. And he made a variety of typical blue jay vocalizations. But he lived in the Wildlife Resource Center at the museum, and that's where my office happened to be. And if anyone entered into the Wildlife Resource Center, the creaking of the hinges of the door was recognizable so that I knew somebody had entered my domain. And so I'd be looking for someone to come around the corner. Well, this blue jay learned to imitate that creaking hinge perfectly. And I'd hear that sound and I'd be waiting to hear footsteps or look for a person, and there was no one there. I suspected that Bad Boy was going and snickering in the corner. Likewise, I had an old-fashioned phone back in the days when you had phones with dial tones, ringtones, and he also learned to imitate the ringtone, spot on. More recently at the museum, unfortunately, he just passed away last year. We had a blue jay that we called R2D2 because he would make these really curious little mechanical sounds that sounded like the droid R2D2 from the Star Wars movies. Fascinating, fascinating birds. And they will frequent your bird feeding stations and they're a delight to have in your yard. I guess one of the things that really puts it to the test is when you see a bird the size of a chickadee. And I mean, there's just not much to a chickadee. These are really, really small birds. And yet they happily get through a wintertime. And it's a marvel that they're able to do so. Now, there's lots of strategies that birds can employ. So if you're going to try and get through the winter, remember when we talked about, you have to have a good set of feathers, contour feathers, a wonderful set of downy feathers. Number two is your dietary habits. You want to start looking for things that are high in fat. If you're a Carolina chickadee, as we found out from Doug Ptolemy, we know that researchers showed that for a pair of Carolina chickadees in the Washington, D.C. area, they need to consume literally thousands of caterpillars to raise their families. Caterpillars are incredibly high in protein, and protein is what you need to grow little kids. But if you're an adult chickadee and you want to get through the wintertime, you need fat. And this is true with almost all these birds. And so seeds, it turns out, whether it's a black oil sunflower seed that you're dutifully putting in your bird feeder, or whether it's the seeds that you find that persist on all the plants in our woodland edges and out in our meadows, they tend to be packed with fats. And those fats are really important fuel for creating heat and getting you through the wintertime. These guys also have been known that they are cavity nesters. Sometimes they'll nest in a cavity that was excavated by another bird, perhaps a downy woodpecker. Sometimes in really punky wood, they'll excavate a cavity of their own. But seeking refuge in a cavity is a really important way of getting out of the wind and getting out of the elements. And sometimes being in there with another one of your kind. The technical term, I think, is called cuddling. Sometimes you'll see this in a bluebird box. You open it up in the middle of wintertime and there's 5 or 6 bluebirds in there. So they're conserving heat by huddling together en masse. Really cool bird. In the wintertime or any time during the year, we're familiar with the chickadee call, which is the call of the not the breeding call, but the call note of the chickadee, the black-capped chickadee. What's a really interesting thing about that call is the number of Ds at the end can indicate whether there's a presence of potential predators. And the number of Ds can also indicate what the level of threat is. Like DEF CON 5 would be chickadee dee 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 dee, as opposed to the usual chickadee chickadee dee dee chickadee dee dee. So just very interesting. So if you hear, if you go out to feed your feeders and you've got a rather angry or a miffed black-capped chickadee because he was hoping that you were that he'd be able to get some food and he's impatient waiting for you, you might hear that expanded decall of the chickadee note. Other common backyard birds that are here throughout the year that are also turning towards high energy sources, tufted titmice, which is actually a bird that used to have a more southerly distribution, kind of like Carolina wrens and northern cardinals and red-bellied woodpeckers, that have expanded the range, partly through habitat changes, partly through climate change, perhaps, and partly because of bird feeding stations. But you see a beak there that's well designed for gleaning insects and grubs and persistent invertebrate matter they might find, but also is equally adept at taking a sunflower seed and cracking it in half. And if you find something like a piece of millet, you can just swallow that whole, and then you rely on your gizzard, your hard muscular part of your two-part stomach, with the addition of some grit to be able to grind that down and render that useful to you. Cute little birds. Peter, as they're called. I love this close-up of a white-breasted nuthatch. You see that very stout beak, which is great for, again, gleaning for things. These guys go downward on a tree trunk. You see how almost lacy the outermost feathers are as they've been expanded to cover every last square inch of this particular bird. And then you also see the stout, almost not quite upturned, but the very prominent lower bill that's useful for prying things open. They're resident around here and delightful little guys with their yank. But we also get red-breasted nuthatches in eruption years. So these birds are more common further north, but when times get tough, we will see large numbers of them coming down here, and they become common backyard feeder birds as well, with that black stripe through the eyes. Cool birds. How can you miss, a beautiful, elegant drake cardinal in the snow with a massive beak that's designed for cracking nuts and seeds? And it's wonderful if you ever watch them to see how nimble they are with the beak in manipulating that with the tongue, in manipulating the seeds till they get it in the optimum place where when they bear down, it's going to open it up so that ultimately they retain the nut meat or the meat of the seed in their mouth, and then the shell falls away. Also, they bring incredible power to bear. So if you've ever been banding and you've caught a cardinal, or in our case, when we used to do the wildlife rehab and you had one that you were trying to help, if they grab skin, they leave a mark. They have amazing strength in their beak. Just a cool bird, and a bird that you might think doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you were going to try and avoid predation in the wintertime, you probably wouldn't want to be bright red against the white snow. And yet, as we know, the northern cardinal is a very successful bird, again, expanding its range further north, and very widespread and a common bird at backyard bird feeding stations. Another bird that's become very common in the last 50 years is the house finch. And house finches are probably a species that they were not native to Ohio. They're native to the American West. They are a North American species, but they were being sold illegally in the New York City area back in the 40s under the moniker Hollywood finches. I love that, Hollywood finches, because their glamorous red coloration. And the red coloration is very much due to the carotenoid pigments that they encounter in the food that they eat. Less of it and less red or less prominent red, or they might actually even look yellow, yellow-orange. Anyway, the folks that were selling these birds were doing so illegally, and rather than get caught with the goods when they were found out, they released the birds. And for a decade and a half or so, they barely clung on to life in the greater New York City area and out on Long Island. But we think they started adapting to backyard bird feeding stations very successfully, and that allowed their numbers to explode. And now they are widespread all over Eastern North America, and their Eastern North American range now comes in contact with their Western North America range. Fascinating bird. Birds that we're very, very familiar with, birds like the robin that, are in our yards everywhere. This is a large thrush that has just beautifully adapted itself to the human landscape. So when we take a look at a suburban landscape and we look at all of that grass, this one thing that here at Nature in My Backyard, we're trying to do something about lessening. There's very little prey or food out there, and there's very little that can support just about any animal, except starlings and robins can sometimes go through and find worms in whatever invertebrates, depending on whether the landowner is using all sorts of pesticides. If there are invertebrates, they can find them. And we usually think about the robin as a worm eater. The early bird gets the worm type of thing. Well, we find that there's a large number of robins that spend the winter here. Are they the robins that nest in your yard? Tough to say. Those robins might have migrated down to Tennessee or Kentucky or further south. But we definitely have a lot of robins that stay here. I remember there was a Christmas bird count in Lake County. This is probably 1983, and out in Mentor Marsh, we had a roost of some 4,000 American robins, huge numbers. But there's not going to be a whole lot of worms available when the ground's frozen and it's covered with snow. So they turn very effortlessly to persistent fruits. In this case, they're eating sumac. Sumac is not, Staghorn sumac is not particularly, it's not the most palatable thing in the world, but it's nutrient dense. And so sometimes it's the thing that they turn to later in the season after they have exhausted hawthorns and crab apples and whatever else, whatever other persistent fruits. Definitely they go through the high fat fruits first. So if you notice that your flowering dogwood was laden with all of these just juicy white fruits, those are high in fat. They have a short shelf life, and you find that birds generally that like those kinds of fruits will move in there and consume them first. They're like top on the list, which is very useful because obviously their palatability is high, and that's incredibly useful because they don't have a shelf life. And if, in fact, that flowering dogwood wants these birds to eat the fruit and then go poop its seed out someplace else, doing the job that the flowering dogwood wants it to do, the dissemination of seeds, then it behooves it to make sure that those seeds are consumed. It's not always perfect timing, but some people bring up the whole idea of a foliar flag when you find that some vines, creeper or poison ivy or sumac, where the leaves turn very vibrant colors, which they're going to turn regardless, because as the supply of nutrients is cut off to the leaf, it stops producing chlorophyll, and then you see what is revealed are the other pigments that were already present in the leaf, but they were covered up by the chlorophyll. And it turns out that these bright colors, though, seem to correspond with the ripe fruits. And so it has been advanced that they are a form of foliar flag. Hey, it's kind of like, hey, birds, come on in here, eat our fruit. It's now available. Bluebirds likewise. So we get bluebirds. There's bluebirds in my Kirtland neighborhood, and they're here year round. It's delightful to hear their call. They will sometimes come in on suet, sometimes come in for mealworms if you put out dried mealworms. But they're for the most part, they're foraging and surviving on persistent fruits. So that becomes a really important strategy for so many species, is just to change your diet in the wintertime and go with the flow, go with what's out there, because those berries, those fruits tend to be high in fats and high in things that you really need. And so that whole idea, how you get through the wintertime, you can change your diet, you can do everything you can to make sure that you're incredibly well insulated and that your feathers are properly maintained, your contoured feathers. If you ever take a look at the feet of a bird, these pileated woodpecker on the left and the male downy woodpecker on the right don't necessarily show it very well, but it's great to see the female pileated in the act of feeding. Let's see if I have another one that shows. Now, I love this photograph, though. You can just see the tip of her tongue underneath the fruit. But birds have naked tibiotarsi and feet. And so that brings up the point of, how do you keep those warm in the wintertime? And I am going to go back just a couple pictures here. You take a look at these bluebirds, and you're taking a look at the bird either left or right, and you see that there's absolutely no insulation on the feet. They're covered with scales. But you probably also noticed when you carved up that turkey, if it came with its feet, which it probably didn't, but there's no meat on the foot or the tibiotarsus. It's just tendons. So all of the muscles are actually back further up the bird's leg, covered with a generous supply of feathers. But it does beg the question, you've got to still send blood down there. You've got to keep your tissues alive, even though you don't have a lot of muscles down there. That's living tissue down there. You have to nourish it in all those joints and toes. You have to continue, the scales on your feet have to continue to grow. So how do you prevent your feet from just being these radiators of your body heat to the atmosphere? And particularly if you're something like a duck that's swimming in the water that's 31 or 32 degrees or 33 degrees, you'd figure that would literally radiate out all the heat from your body in very short order. Certainly, if you were a human being that was swimming in there, you'd probably last 10 minutes. So one of the adaptations that birds have is they have a countercurrent blood supply system, so that arterial blood that's going down through the arteries of the upper part of the leg come in contact with the veins that are bringing back cooled venous blood from the foot. And through a countercurrent exchange network, basically a heat exchanger, they pre-warm the blood that's coming back into the body as they pre-cool the blood that's going out to the foot. And in that way, it's an amazingly efficient system. They don't waste any of their precious body heat. So they can send oxygenated blood down there. They can make sure that the foot's in good working order, but they don't do so at the risk of losing their body heat. So all birds have this, whether you're adapted for wintertime conditions or not. Actually, in the case of something like a turkey vultures have a delightful habit of occasionally defecating on their legs. And the urates that come out, there's not a whole lot of water in the urine of a bird. They have a highly efficient urinary system that excretes uric acid rather than urea. We get rid of urea as a form of getting rid of our nitrogenous wastes, but urea requires a lot of water to flush it from your system. And if you're flushing out a lot of water, an old man like me, you pee a lot, you got to replace that water, and water's not always so available. Well, a legacy of the reptilian past is the fact that birds excrete uric acid, which is highly concentrated. It's almost chalky. It's the white of what you see coming out in bird droppings. And it requires very little water, but you can't have a bladder. It's toxic. You can't hold it up. Uric acid is what causes gout in us. And so you just need to get rid of it. But turkey vultures will sometimes release that on their feet in the summertime, and it's thought that perhaps it might help cool them as they're pumping blood down through their feet in very hot conditions, that it might actually radiate some body heat out, and it might be useful there. Also been suggested in a turkey vulture that the uric acid might have a antiseptic um, effect on the feet, killing undesirable bacteria that are lurking there. Anyway, curious. So woodpeckers, we do have woodpeckers that migrate. Our northern flickers, you'll sometimes see some of them around, but most of them clear out of town. A lot of red-headed woodpeckers can leave town, though there are some red-headed woodpeckers will be here winter round. Our sapsuckers generally leave town, but again, you can sometimes find some sapsuckers. But our downy woodpeckers, our hairy woodpeckers, our red-bellied woodpeckers, our pileated woodpeckers, these guys are pretty much here year-round. They are here year-round, and it's delightful to see them. They can forage for lots of things. If you ever go walking through a field where there's been stands of goldenrod, oftentimes you'll find these big bulbous sort of blobs or orbs on the stems. And that's a gall, and inside that gall there is generally a larva of a wasp. And downy woodpeckers are incredibly good at poking a little hole in there and extracting the juicy little invertebrate that's inside. Both of them can use their beak to drill into things looking for food. In the case of the pileated woodpecker, they can really make things fly. Pileated woodpecker here on the right, there's a male with that bright red mustache and the red coming all the way down his forehead to his beak. But these guys can make the chips fly, and you can generally tell their handiwork because it's square or rectangular. And they're trying to get to heartwood. And it's not because they want to kill the tree, but they're interested in carpenter ants, which is their favorite food. And the carpenter ants are actually going to be living in the rotten heart of a tree. So they need to get through the outer bark to be able to uncover the places where then they can use that amazing long tongue, which goes all the way back around the back of their head, all the way up over the top of their head, all the way up over by one of their nostrils. That's hard back. So they can really stick the thing out. It has a barbed tip that doesn't necessarily spear a beetle larva in there, but it can drag it back out, pulling it against the edge of the burrow. So really very, very cool. You can see their interesting orientation of their feet with two toes forward and two toes back. And they've got, you see it better on the red-headed woodpecker on the left with the powerful tail feathers, the central tail feathers that are incredibly stiffened and act as a functional springboard for them. Very, very useful as they go sort of hopping, bounding up the side of a tree. And both magnificent creatures. Pileated woodpeckers are very vocal, kind of a maniacal laugh. They oftentimes announce when they're approaching your bird feeding station. We put suet out for them, suet cakes, and they're pretty regular visitors out here in our little corner of Old Town Kirtland. So it's not real country, but these guys, since their numbers bottomed out probably in the 40s, early 50s, they've really staged a remarkable comeback and are doing quite well and are becoming more and more a backyard bird in suburban areas. Red-headed woodpeckers, they were incredibly common at the turn of the last century, and then their numbers seemed to decline over the 20th century. They're kind of the same size as red-bellied woodpeckers. Red-bellied pecker were expanding their range northward. Whether there was conflict there or it turns out that there was a lot of habitat, sort of broken habitat, savanna habitat, orchard habitat, widely spaced trees, swamplands, that was more conducive to red-headed woodpeckers. And so that habitat was diminishing over the course of the 20th century. And so their numbers are actually going from perhaps an artificial high in 1900 to something less. But their numbers seem to be pretty robust now. And you see them if you're in Shaker Heights, you walk around Lower Lake. Oftentimes you see them in the oaks around there. Extraordinary bird. Um, and here's your red-bellied woodpecker, a male with its red belly showing. And again, you see those stiffened tail feathers that form the springboard. Um, so this is a really cool group of birds. And it brings you up to this idea of, by the way, I love this line. The woodpecker visited a petrified forest. He found it impeccable. Thought you'd like that. Um, so this just is a little segue into bird feeding. So a lot of people ask, should I feed the birds? And the answer is sure. If you're honest about why you're feeding them, the birds would probably survive perfectly well without any food from you. There is plenty of natural food out there, though. The more you plant your yard in native plants, the greater the feeding opportunities for our native birds that are wintering here. But it's if you're honest about the fact that you're feeding them so that you can see them closer, that's fine. Um, I would say that if you're feeding them in the wintertime and we have intense cold snaps, that's not a good time to stop feeding them. If you've got a bunch of birds coming to your feeders, I would continue to make sure that they have food. In terms of the foods to provide, black oil sunflower seed and millet um, are highly desirable to many, many, many species. Um, Niger seed, thistle seed is highly prized by the finches. Peanuts are loved by jays and red-bellied woodpeckers and others. And suet is popular for just about all of them. I have chickadees and nuthatches and house sparrows and tufted titmice and all of the woodpeckers coming in on the suet. So the suet tends to be a really, really popular item. And I am guilty of keeping my suet feeders filled year round because I do enjoy having pileated woodpeckers come in with their youngsters and red-headed woodpeckers come in with their youngsters. It's a delight to see. But another thing that is important to these birds is a source of open water. And if you can have a bird bath, if you have the means of having some kind of a water vessel that you've got a little submersible heater, you can see this song sparrows looking for perhaps a little drink down there, maybe a place to bathe in shallow water. Bathing, sometimes surprisingly in cold conditions, bathing is another part of helping to keep your feathers in the peak condition, just like dust bathing is, which is a strange thing. I observed a turkey in my backyard this summer, and this friggin' turkey had a little dusty area and it went in there and it dusted itself over and it was on its side. I don't know, the other side. It was just having a grand old time. And when it finally stood up and walked away and ruffled its feathers, there was a huge cloud of dust that came up. It was a riot to see it. That's done to deal with parasites that you might find on the feathers, feather lice and the like. Carolina wrens winter year-round, and normally they would be eating invertebrates, but they'll come in on suet and occasionally seed. Um, the goldfinches we talked about before that will come in on thistle seed, they also have an interesting strategy you see in a lot of in some ducks and others, and that is the males have very gaudy plumage in the breeding season, the late spring throughout the summer, early fall, but then they'll molt and they'll look very similar to the females in the winter. So they're less obvious to potential predators. And that's a big deal because predators exist that love to eat birds. So here we have another American tree sparrow on the left. There you've got a Cooper's hawk on the right. Cooper's hawks are bird killers. They're short-winged, long-tailed accipiter hawks. They're designed for hunting birds in close quarters. And they're going to go where the birds are. So if you have a bird feeding station and a Cooper's hawk shows up, guess what? That's the price you pay for gathering a lot of birds in one spot. And if you say, what am I going to do about that? All I can say is you're now feeding all the birds. It's might be hard to watch predation in action, but it is a fundamental part of nature. Each one of these Cooper's hawks probably has to kill at least two songbirds a day to be able to sustain itself. And it's definitely, if you've got all the birds from a couple of yards that are all at your bird feeding station, then trust me, the Cooper's hawk is going to show up. More and more, wild turkeys have become a very common sight in our backyards, in our parks, everywhere else. They are fond of acorns and other seeds. They'll sometimes come up and feed on whatever the detritus that's on the ground below your bird feeding stations. And it's always impressive to see this bird, particularly if you happen to be walking through the woods and you surprise it and it takes to the air. Because we always think about turkeys running around. Well, they're like a 747 when they take off. And indeed, they do so every day because late day they look for a place to roost, as every bird does. And safety for a wild turkey is roosting in the branches of a low tree where a coyote or some other predator can't get them. Other organisms that are out there, if you get a warm day and a spring thaw, or sometimes in February, you might see a mourning cloak butterfly, which is really odd, but they winter over as adults, and so it's possible to encounter them. Insects have a wide variety of ways of getting through. The ones that don't migrate, they're wintering over as adults, as eggs, as pupa, or larvae. So, it's kind of the whole hodgepodge, and each has its own unique strategy to be able to do that. Some of our invertebrate friends, our lower vertebrate friends, amphibian friends, spring peepers and wood frogs, for instance, that occupy vernal pools in the spring, these guys will hunker down into wet soil, and they actually can tolerate being frozen pretty much solid. And they use glucose as a cryoprotectant. Large amounts of glucose in the cells reduce the amount of water in the cells. And again, as the water crystallizes, it doesn't rupture the cell walls, and they can sustain almost, if not total freezing, which is a heck of a trick. If you're an animal like a turtle, like this beautiful snapping turtle here, turtles, water turtles at least, like painted turtles and snapping turtles, are going to be wintering over down in the muck, the bottom of a place like Lower Lake, for as long as Lower Lake continues to survive. I didn't say that. And they have an interesting strategy. They can't breathe. If the lake freezes over, you're locked away. This is an air-breathing animal. It's cold-blooded or ectothermic. That is, it depends upon exterior sources of heat. If the surface water is frozen, the water temperature itself is probably 32, and it's going to be awfully cold down there. It means your body's 32. So they don't necessarily freeze solid, but they have to have some way of dealing with hypoxia. There's just no oxygen, and they're building up lactic acid in their bloodstream. Well, through the marvel of their cloaca, the common exit point for urinary and reproductive and fecal products, it has a highly vascularized, a rich blood supply around the cloaca, and they actually can do some gaseous exchange, absorb some oxygen, get rid of some carbon dioxide through their cloacal skin, which is a neat trick. And then also their skeletal system helps with carbonates that can deal with lactic acid and sort of attenuate it as it builds up in their body so they can winter over. They're not invulnerable. I remember after the winter of 1977, which was just one of the hardest winters we've ever had in northeastern Ohio. I was up at Winus Point Marsh, and in the springtime, as the marshes thawed out, there were dead snapping turtles everywhere, where they were becoming active, and the ice was too thick, and they couldn't get access to a place to breathe. Snakes, likewise, are dedicated hibernators, though we call it with reptiles brumation. They'll find a burrow, an old animal burrow. They'll get below the frost line, and they just remain dormant or torpid, if you will. And because their metabolic rate's so slow, then they don't have to waste much of their stored energy, and they can last the winter down there. So getting towards the end here, some of the famous ways of getting around wintertime you find in the rodent group. This is a woodchuck in a tree, and you might say, well, that's an odd place to see a woodchuck, other than you remember that they are a member of the Sciuridae. They are squirrels, ground squirrels, large ground squirrels, but they're squirrels. But they actually are true hibernators. They've got burrows underground, and you get to the end of November, and these guys have put on huge amounts of fat while the living was easy, and now they're tucked away in a nice, cozy burrow underground, and they let their body temperature go and drift within a couple degrees of freezing. Whatever the soil temperature is will be their body temperature. And they can go months. They might rouse from time to time to take care of some metabolic business, but they can go for months. Whether they get up on February 2nd, well, nice legend. But anyway, it's a remarkable way. And some ground squirrels out west can basically spend almost 8 months of the year in hibernating or estivating mode. Pretty impressive. We have chipmunks, which have been bedeviling you in your backyard. Jim Bissell used to call them striped wood rats. But they really are pretty adorable, really well adapted to a variety of our backyard habitats. And they are not true hibernators in that they'll rouse from time to time, and they might come out during a mild spell, and they might also have salted away food down in their burrows, something that a groundhog does not do. So if you've got a food supply down there, it means you can rouse yourself and you can, snack away. It's like, eating pretzels in bed, that type of thing. The groups that are pretty active through the wintertime are the squirrels. And I realize I'm going a little bit long here. So this is a red squirrel with an itch. And red squirrels, they look like sort of jumbo chipmunks with longer tails. Generally found associated with conifers. They will have a cavity in a conifer is a place where they prefer to be, though they can create drays as well. We find black morph gray squirrels. So the gray squirrel is a ubiquitous, very common species of squirrel. But here in Ohio and a few places like Kent and up at the Holden Arboretum, the black form of the gray squirrel was introduced, and now we find that it has spread all over, as well as the more typical gray squirrel. And fox squirrels, which we know in all of our suburban yards. And this guy shows you what happens when it's cold out. So he's out, he's foraging, but look at how he's pulled his forepaws against his chest, and he's got that tail sort of curled up underneath him. So even though he's exposed on a tree branch, he's trying to protect his extremities as best he can. So they, like a lot of mammals, you have a really generous fur coat with dense, underneath the guard hairs, with dense woolly fur that helps insulate and keep you warm. And they'll have cavity nests, though sometimes they might be in their drays. Here's another view. If you see this particular squirrel's holding food, I can't tell what nut it's got in its forepaws, but that's typical. In my backyard, I just saw a squirrel go bounding across the yard with a walnut in its feet. We've had actually in its mouth, but then it went up to a tree branch to feed on it. And we had a really good year for walnuts from our one black walnut tree. And basically, the fox squirrels have parked themselves there and consumed as much of that food as they possibly can. This is a dray, D-R-E-Y. This is the nest, generally the warm weather nest, the nest where a squirrel would have its babies. And you might first see that and think it's a hawk nest or something, but you see there's leaves in it, and a hawk would be all sticks, hawk or an eagle. And so it turns out that these things are pretty remarkably made. And I had a description that was kind of cool. Bernd Heinrich found a dray, and he said that this dray, rather than just being a random mass of leaves, he said it featured, this was a 12-inch diameter nest, featured 26 layers of flattened oak leaves that were dried and overlapped like shingles, that sheltered about a 1.5-inch layer of shredded bark, which then ensconced a 3.5-inch wide central chamber, and the layers inside were all bone dry, and the nest had come down in a driving rainstorm. So the outside of the nest was totally wet, but none of that had penetrated. utilizing the oak leaves in this case. The tannin in the oak leaves are naturally proof or water resistant. So it's quite an engineering feat. So it's kind of neat to see these things and as they you find them in the backyard as all things are revealed in the wintertime. Also, we have animals that are very sensible. Raccoons will come out. They also might feed at the base of your bird feeding station too. But it turns out that these guys are um, sensible about about foraging. If you have really crappy weather, they're just going to stay hunkered down in their den, and then they'll come out and forage when you get a break in the weather. And that's pretty much true of skunks, and it's pretty much true of opossums and a lot of those middle-sized mammalian predators. Another animal that's active all year long and is definitely in your yard is the eastern cottontail rabbit. And they're changing their diet from green stuff to shoots to bark to buds. Um, and you can oftentimes tell that the difference of what, let's say, a deer's done to a shrub to versus a rabbit, because a rabbit's got, two pair of incisor teeth. Actually, it's got peg-like incisor teeth behind them. But when they go after a bud, they snip it clean, whereas a deer has a lower set of incisor teeth and an upper callus pad, so they strip. They strip, they don't snip. But these guys stay generally pretty close to heavy cover because they know that that's their best defense against predation. And predation is a very real thing. Here's a meadow vole. Meadow voles are active all winter long too. You might have meadow voles in your backyard. They live a subnivean lifestyle, which means they're active right at ground level under the snow, and they create a whole burrow system so they can continue to dine on the foods the green foods that they find down there. But if they ever pop out, they end up being prey for a lot of animals, like this eastern screech owl might take a vole. Red-shouldered hawks would love to eat the vole. Red foxes love to eat vole. You get a sense coyotes will eat voles. Coyotes will eat rabbits. Coyotes would eat squirrels. Coyotes in the wintertime would eat anything they can possibly get their teeth into. And you definitely have coyotes in your yard no matter where they live. We got to that point, we just have to accept that. They are a part of our landscape. And I think they're pretty noble animals. Talk for another day. So last in this treatise about animals, we have white-tailed deer. And if you take a look at deer, the adaptations for wintertime are really amazing. They're long guard hairs that grow from that sparse red coat that covered them in the summertime are hollow hairs. They're tubular, they trap air. They're incredibly good insulation. And look at all the fur at the entrance of the ear to protect the sensitive skin, to insulate the ear. If you're a buck like this, by the time you get into January, you probably will have lost those antlers because you've done with the breeding season, the rut season, which we're in the middle of the rutting season now, and they're no longer useful to you. So this is, just they're really handsome animals, even though they tear up our landscape and we curse what they do, and we really bemoan what they do to our forests by reducing the herbaceous layer and pruning things up to a browse line. They're extraordinary creatures. You got to admit. So last thing is that in wintertime, what do you find is you find tracks. And when you have snow, and yesterday looking around the yard, we had so many cool tracks that are all gone today in the slush of this pouring rain. But you see on the left side trailway of eastern cottontail, where you see the back feet are at the leading edge of the track, the big oblong feet, and there's a little bit of a point to that. And then the forefeet are behind, and usually they're staggered like that, and that's the way that they hop through the snow. The image on the right looks like a bird of prey has caught perhaps a vole that it heard or was aware of at the base of the snow. But Ernest Thompson Seton had a great line. He said, "Never forget the trail. Look ever for the track in the snow. It is the priceless, unimpeachable record of the creature's life and thought in the oldest writing on earth. And so you might even find tracks like this, where somebody face planted. I'm not saying who. So um, this is a time too, though, we get to the solstice, the shortest day of the year, the day that seems bleakest, but it's also a turning point in nature because every day after this gets longer, and with the lengthening days, that is a signal to all of nature to start preparing for the spring that is to come. And if you're a bird, in this non-breeding season, you let your reproductive organs atrophy to 1/100th or 1/200th their functional size because you don't need them. And that would be an extravagant waste of weight. But now you need them. So if you're a great horned owl or if you're a bald eagle, starting with those first couple days in after the solstice, that's a trigger for you that you need to start increasing the size of your reproductive organs, that you're responding to the circadian cues, and so that you will be ready to court and lay eggs in an old hawk nest, in the case of a great horned owl, by as early as the middle to the end of January. And that's so that you can get a pair of youngsters like this off of the nest by late spring. So the timing of that is critical, and they have to go right at it. Bald eagles do the same thing. Bald eagles in Ohio generally have eggs in the nest in February. So just after the winter solstice, you expect to find the pairs who haven't probably gone very far from their nesting territory to start bringing in sticks and adding a fresh layer to the top and engaging in courtship activity and preparing for the season that is to come. And then before you know it, you get to February and the red-winged blackbirds return. They're on every fence post and they're doing their conqueries. The Carolina wren on the right is doing its tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle song. The chickadee has turned from its chickadee call to its plaintive phoebe call, and spring is just right around the corner. And I think I've gone enough over. I'm just going to leave you. I love this etching done by Carol Collette of A Clear Winter Night. Kind of sums it up where we think that we've reached a time where nature is dormant. Sure, it's dormant, but there's signs of life everywhere if you look closely enough. And following animal trackways, exploring the behavior of the birds that are coming to your feeder, perhaps witnessing the great chain of life when predation happens before your eyes, or you see evidence of it in the tracks that are in the snow. And just know that nature has prepared well for the season that is to come following winter. And every bud is laden, and every bird is just ready to launch into song and get on with the business of carrying on with the next cycle of this planet around the sun. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I appreciate your tolerance. So I don't know how much time we have for any comments. Let's see, I got to get up here. I want to stop my screen saving. How do I do that? Stop. And do that. Okay, and I'll go to the chat and I'll see what we have. We have some greetings. We have a shout out to Jane who came by to Pat's yard to check it out as part of this. January 14th, I misspoke before, is going to be Hope Taft on the ecoregions of Ohio and the plants that grow there. Mark was telling us about a red-shouldered hawk perched in an evergreen near his bird feeder last winter on a -15-degree morning. It was actually shivering. Shivering isn't a bad thing. Shivering sometimes is exactly what you do to generate heat by the fast contraction of muscles that generates heat. He said it caught a starling at the bird feeder and then pinned it to the ground in the snow for about 10 minutes. He said, I believe it was holding on to that starling for so long to warm its feet before finally eating it, which is an interesting thing. Saw-whet owls have been known to catch mice. And if the mouse was particularly large, Oftentimes they'll retreat to a roost and they'll sit there and sleep away holding the mouse in their talons. Well, if it's really cold, the mouse can refreeze. And if they want to eat it, what do? They pull the mouse up underneath their abdominal feathers to thaw it so that it makes it useful for consuming. Um, Kathy Bradley said, we have a heated bird bath, which many birds drink from, but the house sparrows use for bathing in winter, which makes us refill it twice a day. Lee Fabens has sent a photo message to my phone number. We'll have to check that out later. I don't have it my thing here. As Wendy spoke in her Cleveland Heights backyard, she said, as you speak, there are 4 rutting deer in my backyard neighbor's yard, apparently digging a vernal pool as they frolic in a big puddle. Um, anyway, and lots of thanks. So we thank you for your attendance at this, and I'm sorry I spoke a little bit long, but my encouragement to you, these were sort of random observations on the season by an old-time dinosaur naturalist, and it's just there is something to be discovered. It's a great time to be out. There's something about the crisp days of winter. It's invigorating to get that cold air deep in your lungs. And it's just amazing to pay attention to the nature around you, particularly the rewards of planting native plants in your backyard to see how nature is responding right where you live. And that does it for this edition of Brown Bagging It from My Backyard. I'm Harvey Webster, and we'll see you next month with Hope Taft. Thanks much, everybody. Happy holidays to you.